The morning I found a trench across my front lawn, I stood on the porch with a cup of coffee in my hand and felt something cold settle in my chest, not the kind of cold you get from bad weather, but the kind that tells you someone has moved the line between your life and theirs, and they did it with a shovel. It was wide enough to see the soil layers, long enough to cut my little garden in half, and running like a scar straight toward my driveway, with a loop of black cable sticking out like someone had forgotten to finish a bad chore. I kept staring because at first I wanted it to be a mistake, somebody's contractor gone rogue, a lawn service with a weird idea of landscaping. And then I saw Ruth and Lana across the street, leaning on the mailbox, smiling like this was a punchline. I'm Eli Mercer, I keep things simple. I like my yard. I like the creek in the porch swing. I like knowing where my property ends because that's the border of the life I built. Ruth and Lana? They'd lived in the cul-de-sac longer than I had, walked the line between neighborly and territorial, and had this little way of making rules feel like their own private script. When I asked them, "Hey, who's digging my yard?" Ruth shrugged and said, "Community project, Eli. We're improving the block." Lana added, "It'll help the whole street. Trust us." Their voices were syrupy, thinly sweet, slick with something else I couldn't name. That's when my unease turned into the stubborn kind of attention that won't let you sleep. Act 1, the setup is small, then it gets personal. I tried the HOA, I called a provider, I walked to the county records. Every polite path came back with a shrug or a redirect. The contractor supposedly working for the sisters had no license that matched the truck, and the community fiber paperwork they flashed at the HOA meeting was thinner than a napkin. People in meetings nodded and used words like expedite and review, which is HOA for "we'll circle back in a month." In the meantime, the trench became part of the scenery. Kids walking their dogs braided it into their routes. A mailman stepped over it like it belonged, except it didn't. It belonged to me. Act 2, the turn. A single night where patience runs out is the kind of moment you don't plan. It makes itself known. I started documenting. Timestamps on photos, short videos, a voice memo here and there, the mundane architecture of evidence. One morning, while filming, I noticed a crudely spliced junction box hidden under a tarp by Ruth's porch. It looked like something someone had put together in a garage and hoped no one would trace back to them. I felt the floor drop out of my chest because suddenly this wasn't neighborly overreach. It was something else: theft of service, trespass, deliberate concealment. I called a lawyer who told me the obvious, the comforting, and the cold. Gather evidence. Don't touch anything you don't own. Document damage. Speak to the HOA in writing. The lawyer's voice was calm, but it gave me a plan, and plans make rage useful. As I moved through those days, the neighborhood changed tone. Ruth and Lana began leaving friendly notes on my door that read like legal threats with soft edges. Consider this a final notice, for the benefit of the community. They'd stand at the fence and talk about civic duty with the kind of conviction people bring to small cruelties. At a potluck, Lana told a guest, loud enough for me to hear, "Eli's just protective of his patch." There it was, motive, simple as jealousy, maybe a dash of control. They wanted to put something in the ground that gave them leverage, a proprietary line, a perceived authority, and my resistance threatened what they'd planned. I won't pretend it was clean or cinematic at first. It was dirty, late nights of scanning through footage, waiting by the back window for someone to make the same mistake twice. But the evidence stacked: photos, invoices, a technician's confirmation that the cable was not installed by any licensed provider in the county, and most damning, a voicemail where Ruth barked into her phone, "Make sure it's under the fence where Eli won't see it." Hearing that, I felt a strange calm. That voicemail was the thread I could pull. One clear, cold evening, I walked the line between lawful patience and whatever comes after. I printed the documents, I labeled the photos, I wrote the timeline on a legal pad, and I walked down the street with copies in a folder to the HOA president's house, to the neighborhood watch leader's porch, to anyone who would look me in the eye and say, "This is okay." No one said it was okay. Instead, the HOA called a meeting for the following Wednesday. Ruth and Lana RSVP'd with smiles like they were trading aces. The public confrontation is where stories usually break into two: what happens and how we remember it. They brought their own folder of permits, thick with photocopies and signatures I later learned were forged or misattributed. Ruth stood at the front, hands on the lectern, with the exact tone of someone who believes being loud equals being right. "We were improving the neighborhood," she said, voice sweeping. "We only wanted what's best for everyone." Lana nodded, solemn, the kind of solemn sold at a discount whenever guilt needs an alibi. I laid out the evidence: the voicemail, the text note, photos of the splice, and a copy of the utility maps showing no easement across my lot. I said, slowly, so everyone could hear, "This isn't a civic project. It's trespass. It's concealment. It's your yard, my yard, and a line you put in without asking." Phones came out like wildflowers, cameras, quick recordings, the neighborhood watching itself. You could feel the crowd tilt when a few older members who'd known Ruth and Lana for years frowned, because communities protect their own until presented with facts they can't ignore. Then came the worst moment and the best moment all in one. Ruth, pushed, snapped. "You think you can run me out of here?" she spat, the line between irritation and threat thin as skin. Lana stepped forward and said something I'll never forget. "We didn't take from you. We offered." My friend Jonah, who'd come for support, asked, "Offered to whom?" And Ruth looked at him like he'd suggested she'd robbed a bank. That's when the neighborhood voices shifted from speculation to a chorus asking for accountability. The HOA president closed the meeting, face taut, and promised an investigation. What followed was consequence not immediate, but inevitable. The HOA's inspector came, ordered the splice inaccessible and unauthorized, a small legal hammer that landed where it mattered: fines, a demand for immediate removal of the line, and a temporary suspension of voting privileges for Ruth and Lana. People outside the circle watched and judged, and the sisters' social standing seeped away faster than anyone predicted. They were quiet after that, their fronts shuttered, the smiles replaced with the sort of small, evasive glances that say a story is losing its narrator. But the after was more complicated than triumph. Justice in neighborhoods rarely reads like a movie. My yard got repaired, new sod, the trench filled. A neighbor with a bobcat who owed me a favor did it right, and I sat on the porch one evening and felt a weight lift and another weight settle in its place. The HOA had ruled, but the sisters still lived next door. There were weekends when I'd find passive-aggressive notes on my mailbox, or someone would leave a lawn ornament staring at my porch like it was an accusation. I learned that winning a fight doesn't always mean peace follows. Sometimes it means the battle line moves to quieter places. What changed me wasn't the victory. It was the slow, honest look at why lines matter. It's easy to laugh about a buried cable, to call it petty or small. But boundaries are more than property markers, they're the visible edges of consent and respect. When someone digs without asking, they aren't just moving dirt, they're moving the terms of your life. And that's what made this personal. I kept thinking about how easy it is for small transgressions to become bigger ones if nobody calls them out. I kept thinking about the old men who stood up at the meeting and said, "We've lived here 60 years. You tell us who to be," and how they meant something softer. We are a community, not a playground for private power. So what now? The yard is green again, the splice is gone, and I still wave when we pass on the sidewalk. Civility is a tool, it's not an excuse. I post the timeline online sometimes, because memory is better with receipts, and I check my property lines every couple of months the way some people check their mail. But more than that, I started conversations about how our HOA handled conflicts, about transparency, about how easy it is for authority to look like benevolence when wrapped in the right words. I stood at one meeting and said, if we don't make rules that protect the quiet people, the ones who keep their heads down and tend their yards, then power will always grow in the shadows. There's a scene that stays with me. The day the sisters packed away the tarp and the bobcat rolled through the cul-de-sac, the neighborhood pausing like a camera breath. Lana paused at her gate, looked at me without smiling, and for a second I thought I saw regret, not a confession, but the shape of it. That's the thing about endings. Some are tidy, most are messy, and the ones that stick are part apology, part lesson, and a little unresolved, because life rarely draws a period where a screenplay needs one. If you've ever had a neighbor cross a line, I want to hear it. Tell me what you did. Tell me how it landed. Tell me whether you kept the peace or made the rules fight back. Was it jealousy? Power? A misunderstanding that grew teeth? Drop a comment with your story, and let's talk about what justice looks like in our blocks. If you like this, share it with someone who lives next door to a story. If you want more, Subscribe, I'll bring more of these small neighborhood dramas, because dirt and deeds and the people who live on them make for better lessons than any textbook.